You're listening to Silent Crime Stories. Tonight, we step into the shadows once more, into a story that someone somewhere tried to keep buried. Pull up a chair, turn off the lights, and listen closely, because every detail matters. Before we get into this story, I want to warn you. What you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing cases I've ever covered. Not because of the gore, though what happened here is violent, but because of what it forces us to confront about childhood, about evil, and about the systems that are supposed to protect the most vulnerable among us. There are no easy answers at the end of this one. There's just a question that doesn't go away. In the spring of 2007, in the forgotten flatlands of Bihar, one of the poorest states in India, the warm, thick air of the pre-monsoon season hung over the rice fields like a wet blanket. Children played in muddy puddles between clay-walled homes. Women carried water on their heads in earthen jugs. Men worked other people's fields for pennies when they found work at all. Life in the village of Mushahar moved at a pace unchanged for 200 years. Bihar is a place that most of the world has never heard of, and the people of Mushahar exist at the very bottom of even Bihar's social hierarchy. The Mushahar are a Dalit caste, the so-called untouchables, so low in India's ancient caste system that their name in the local tongue literally means rat eaters. A name that dates back to the famines, when eating rodents was the difference between survival and starvation. By 2007, the famine was gone. The name remained, and so did the poverty. The village had no electricity, no running water, no paved roads. Homes were built from mud mixed with straw and animal dung, roofed with bundles of reed. Floors were packed earth, sometimes smoothed with cow dung that, when dried, became hard and kept insects away. Entire families, grandparents, parents, half a dozen children, slept in a single room, with maybe an old blanket on the ground and a few clay pots as their total possessions. Cooking was done over open fires. Latrines didn't exist. The rice field served that purpose, before dawn and after dark, because the women were afraid of snakes and men's eyes. Children here grew up knowing nothing else. No television, no toys, no books. Their world was dirt roads, rain puddles, old tires to kick, sticks to build with. Boys climbed guava trees and stole unripe fruit. Girls as young as 5 carried infant siblings on their hips. Nobody went to school. What was the point? The caste system had already decided their future: physical labor, malnutrition, early death. Violence was ordinary. Men beat their wives. Older brothers beat younger ones. Teachers beat students. Cruelty to animals was entertainment. Children killed chickens, threw rocks at dogs, tormented lizards. A crying child was background noise, like the wind in the reeds. This is where Amarjeet Sada was born, in 1998. There are no medical records from Amarjeet's early childhood. No developmental notes, no vaccination history. He was almost certainly never seen by a doctor. He wasn't officially registered at birth. For years, he didn't exist in any government database. He was one of several children in his family, a middle child, the kind that's easy to overlook. By 2006, when he was about 8 years old, the neighbors had begun to notice something. Not something loud, not tantrums or aggression or screaming fits. Something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. While other children ran and played and made noise, Amarjeet would often stand apart and watch. Just watch. The women of the village would later describe his eyes as disturbing. Blank, flat, devoid of the ordinary light you see in a child's face. He didn't cry when he was hit. He didn't laugh during games. He observed the world around him with a detachment no 8-year-old should possess. The first signs of what was coming appeared in the form of dead animals. Dogs in the village started turning up with their skulls caved in, behind the houses, in the alleyways, lying in pools of blood. At first, people blamed wild dogs or other boys. Then someone caught Amarjeet crouching over a still-living puppy, a stone raised in his hand. Nobody called a psychologist. There were no psychologists. Nobody called the authorities. The police didn't concern themselves with the internal affairs of a Mushahar village. His parents likely beat him. maybe kept him inside for a day or two. And then the village forgot about it. Because in a place where survival is the only priority, nobody has the energy or the vocabulary to recognize the early signs of something much darker. Amarjeet watched, and he learned. He learned that killing gave him something nothing else did, a feeling of control. In a world that was chaotic, brutal, and indifferent, where he was the least of the least, nobody, a body without significance, killing gave him power over something weaker, over a life he could take. And it wasn't enough. In the summer of 2006, Amarjeet's infant sister died suddenly and without explanation. Infant deaths in Mushahar were common. Babies died from dehydration, gut infections, malaria, malnutrition. They died so often that some mothers didn't name their children for the first weeks of life, because what was the point of naming someone who might not survive the month? So when the Sada baby stopped breathing one night, nobody investigated. No autopsy, no doctor, no inquiry. The small body was wrapped in white cloth and buried in a field without a headstone or a name. But then Amarjeet said something. He told a neighbor woman who came to offer condolences that he had done it. The woman assumed the boy was confused or in shock, or simply didn't understand the weight of his own words. She ignored him. A few months later, another infant died. This time, the child of Amarjeet's cousin who lived in the adjacent hut. Sudden, unexplained. The family was devastated and attributed the death to the will of the gods, to evil spirits, to the bad eye. In the belief system of the Mushahar, a blend of Hinduism, animism, and local superstition, death was everywhere, especially the death of children, and the supernatural was always a more accessible explanation than anything else. Amarjeet said something again, this time more directly. He told his mother that he had killed the baby. His mother, illiterate, exhausted, pregnant again, fighting for survival every single day, didn't know what to do with what she heard. Maybe she thought he was lying. Maybe she thought he'd lost his mind. Maybe she was stirring a pot of rice over an open fire and simply couldn't process it. She did nothing. Several months passed. The spring of 2007 arrived with a wall of heat that seemed to radiate up from the ground itself. The air shimmered over the fields. People moved slowly as if every step cost effort. Mothers nursed their infants and prayed the milk wouldn't dry up in the temperature. Near the center of the village, not far from the communal well where women gathered morning and evening to collect water, lived a young mother named Chonchon Devi. She was in her mid-20s but looked older. Life in Mushahar aged women fast. She had recently had a daughter, a girl she named Khushbu, 8 months old. Healthy, alert, smiling. In a place where so many children died, a baby who made it to 8 months was a reason for hope. On May 8th, 2007, Chonchon Devi had to leave her home for a short while. Maybe to fetch water, maybe to visit a neighbor, maybe to gather fuel. The documents don't specify. She left Khushbu sleeping in the hut. She didn't lock the door. Nobody locked their doors in Mushahar. What was there to steal? Everyone was equally poor. She was gone maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour. When she came back, the baby was gone. She started screaming. Other women came running. They searched every hut, every corner of the village. A child that age couldn't walk, couldn't hide. Someone had to have taken her. But who and why? The search went on until dark. Men with torches combed the surrounding fields, calling the baby's name as if an 8-month-old could answer. Chonchon Devi tore at her clothing, called out to the gods. The next morning, at first light, one of the women found something at the edge of the village where the settlement gave way to a stand of bamboo, a scrap of cloth, then another. Then the body. Khushbu was lying in the undergrowth, partially covered with leaves and branches. It was immediately clear she had not died of natural causes. There were bruises across her small body. There were marks on her neck. Her skull bore the evidence of blunt force trauma. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed this child. They had done it with violence, with a ferocity that made it hard to understand what kind of mind had produced it. The village sent for the police, which was itself an unusual act. Law enforcement rarely came to Mushahar unless something had gone seriously wrong. Two officers arrived on motorcycles, looked at the body, asked questions. They had no idea where to begin. No obvious evidence, no witnesses, no apparent motive. They started interviewing residents. Everyone was in shock. Nobody had seen anything. Someone mentioned that there had been children playing near Chunchun Devi's hut. But there were always children everywhere. That didn't help. And then somebody mentioned Amarjeet Sada. Somebody remembered the strange stories. His own sister, dead in unexplained circumstances. His cousin's child, same thing. The dogs found dead. The things somebody had seen him do with a stone and a puppy. The sense that something about that boy was wrong. The officers decided to talk to him. Amarjeet Sada was 8 years old at the time of his arrest. He was small for his age, malnourished like nearly all the children in the village, dressed in dirty, oversized clothes that had belonged to someone older. He walked barefoot, his feet hard and cracked from the hot ground. Dark hair, tangled, face unwashed. He looked like every other child in Mushahar. Anonymous, unremarkable, one of hundreds of similar boys in the region. But something in his eyes made the officers uneasy. He looked at them without fear, without the shy hesitation you'd expect from a child confronted by police. He didn't cry. He didn't run. When they asked if he would come with them to answer some questions, he nodded and followed without resistance. They brought him to a room in the village administration building that served as a makeshift interview space. He sat cross-legged on the floor and looked at them. They asked if he knew anything about the disappearance of Chunchun Devi's baby. Amarjeet nodded. He said in a calm, almost indifferent voice, "I killed her." The officers looked at each other. They assumed the boy didn't understand what he was saying, that maybe he'd heard adults talking about the death and was repeating it, or that he was in some kind of traumatic state. Maybe he'd found the body and somehow believed he was responsible. They pressed him. How? Where? Why? Amarjeet answered without hesitation, without emotion. He described how he had entered Chunchun's hut when the mother stepped out, how he had picked up the baby. She was light, even for an 8-year-old boy. How he had carried her to the bamboo grove at the edge of the village, how he had put her down on the ground, and then he began to hit her, with stones, with sticks, with his hands. The baby cried, he said. He remembered that. So he strangled her to make her stop. He held on until she stopped moving. The officers listened with growing horror. This was not a child recounting fantasies. This was a child relaying facts. The details matched what they'd found at the scene. The location of the body, the manner of death. All of it. This was a confession. A real one. They asked about the earlier deaths. His sister, his cousin's child. Amarjeet admitted to both without hesitation. Yes, he had killed his sister. He had taken her when no one was watching and strangled her. Yes, he had killed his cousin's baby. The same way. Strangled. Why? He shrugged. He couldn't explain. He didn't know why. He just wanted to. One of the officers asked whether he understood what it meant to kill someone, whether he knew it was wrong. Amarjeet looked at him with those flat, empty eyes and said, "I know." But he showed no remorse, no distress, no emotion of any kind. He spoke about the 3 murders the way another child might talk about breaking a clay pot or losing a shoe. When the news broke, and it broke fast, the reaction across India was immediate and overwhelming. Television crews descended on Mushahar, which was logistically challenging given how remote and inaccessible the village was. Journalists stood on dirt roads, filming the mud huts and barefoot children, trying to understand how a place like this had produced someone like Amarjeet Sada. The headlines were brutal. World's youngest serial killer. 8-year-old confesses to 3 murders. Psychopathic child from Bihar. Across the country, people struggled to process what they were reading. India was used to violent crime. But this was something different. This was a child. The village itself reacted with a mix of terror and confusion. Most residents had never seen a television camera before. Now their forgotten, ignored community was the center of a national attention. Journalists asked questions nobody could answer. How was this possible? Why did no one intervene? What had happened to this child? Amarjeet's family retreated into silence. His mother refused to speak to reporters, whether from shock or from the cultural norm in Mushahar that women don't discuss family matters publicly, or simply because she genuinely couldn't comprehend what had happened. His siblings were kept away from cameras. Neighbors said different things. Some claimed they had always known something was wrong with the boy, that he had the evil eye, that he didn't play normally, that there was something off about him. Others defended him. He was just a quiet kid, nothing special. And some turned to the supernatural. The boy must have been possessed, they said. A demon must have taken hold of him. Because in a community where the spirit world is as real as the physical one, demonic possession was a more available explanation than child psychopathy. The legal system had almost no idea what to do. Under Indian law, children below the age of 7 cannot be held criminally responsible. They're presumed incapable of understanding the consequences of their actions. Children between 7 and 12 can be prosecuted only if it can be proven that they were sufficiently mature to understand the nature and consequences of what they did. Amarjeet was 8 at the time of the third murder, but the first two, his sister and his cousin's child, had almost certainly been committed when he was 7, possibly younger. That complicated everything. India's juvenile justice system was, at that time, in a catastrophic state. Rehabilitation centers were overcrowded, underfunded, often run by unqualified staff. Some were effectively indistinguishable from prisons. Placing an 8-year-old in such a facility was, depending on your point of view, either the only available option or a guarantee of further damage. But releasing him back to the village wasn't an option either. The community was terrified of him. Mothers kept their children close. Amarjeet had become the village monster, the incarnation of something the community couldn't name or understand, but could feel. The case was sent to a juvenile court in Munger, the nearest city with the relevant jurisdiction. The proceedings were by law closed to the media, but details leaked. Journalists spoke to lawyers, police officers, anyone with access to the case. What emerged was a picture of a child completely without empathy. During hearings, Amarjeet showed no remorse. He didn't weep. He didn't apologize. He demonstrated no understanding of the suffering he had caused. The few psychologists who had access to him were shaken. One later described him as one of the most disturbing individuals he had encountered in his career. And this was a child. Can you call an 8-year-old a psychopath? The clinical literature is divided. Psychopathy is defined by a cluster of traits: absence of empathy, absence of guilt, superficial charm, egocentrism, manipulation, impulsivity. Professionals traditionally avoid diagnosing children with personality disorders because the developing brain is still forming, still capable of change. But in Amarjeet's case, the profile fit almost perfectly. He killed without anger, without fear, without apparent emotional motivation of any kind, not in the heat of rage, not for gain, not for revenge, for the experience of killing itself, for the sense of control over life and death. Experts who tried to understand Amarjeet's case pointed to several factors. First, the extreme poverty of his upbringing, malnutrition, absence of stimulation, lack of medical care. All of these can literally alter the structure of a developing brain. Research on children raised in severe deprivation consistently shows reduced volume in brain regions responsible for emotional regulation and empathy. Second, almost certain exposure to domestic violence. There was no documented evidence, but in a community like Mushahar, where hitting children is entirely normalized, it was nearly inevitable that Amarjeet had both witnessed and experienced violence. Children who grow up in that environment learn that power over the weak is acceptable, that there are no consequences for harming those who cannot fight back. Third, and perhaps most critically, the complete absence of any intervention after the early warning signs. The dead dogs should have been a red flag. In criminology, there's a cluster of behaviors known as the McDonald triad: that research has associated with later violent offending, cruelty to animals, fire setting, and bedwetting. Amarjeet had one of them at 8 years old and nobody responded. If there had been any form of therapeutic intervention, the trajectory might have been altered. But might have been is an empty phrase in the context of Mushahar. There were no therapists, there were no psychologists, there was no social services, there was only survival. And yet, and this is the question that doesn't have a comfortable answer, millions of children grow up in conditions similar to Amarjeet's and don't become killers. Most children of the Mushahar caste live in the same poverty, witness the same violence, suffer the same neglect. They don't murder infants. So something specific to Amarjeet, some combination of neurology, genetics, and circumstance, set him apart. What that was, we don't know. He was never given a comprehensive neurological evaluation. He was never genetically tested. He was a child from a caste of rat-eaters in a forgotten village. Nobody spent money on that. The juvenile court in Munger eventually ruled that Amarjeet was sufficiently mature to be held responsible for his actions, a conclusion supported by his own detailed confessions and by the clarity with which he had described the murders. He was placed in a juvenile correctional facility. Under Indian law, he was to remain there until he turned 18. The facility in Munger was an old, grim building surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. Inside, roughly 50 boys, ages 12, 13, 14, most there for theft or assault or drug-related offenses. Amarjeet was the youngest by several years. The conditions were, to put it mildly, Spartan. Large dormitory rooms with rows of cots, watery food, filthy bathrooms, a few hours of inadequate schooling each week from unqualified teachers. No therapy, no psychological support, no real rehabilitation program of any kind. The older boys terrorized the younger ones. Guards, poorly paid, bored, often corrupt, rarely intervened. Their job was to keep people from escaping, not to ensure anyone's well-being. Logically, Amarjeet should have been the weakest one there. The smallest, the youngest, an easy target. But something strange happened. According to accounts that later leaked from inside the facility, the other boys were afraid of him, not because he was physically imposing or overtly aggressive, but because of something about him. The dead eyes, the total absence of fear, that made people uneasy. When older boys tried to intimidate him, he stared back without any reaction. When he was hit, he didn't cry. When they threatened him, he didn't look away. And sometimes, they said, he laughed. Staff felt it too. One guard later described the experience of having Amarjeet look at him as feeling like the boy could see something others couldn't. Like he was looking through you, he said, not at you. Amarjeet made no friends. He didn't participate in groups. He spent most of his time alone in corners of the courtyard, watching the others. Sometimes he drew patterns in the dirt with a stick. Simple, repeating shapes. He showed no interest in any activity, any game, any interaction. Psychologists who visited the facility sporadically attempted conversations. He responded in monosyllables. Yes. No, I don't know. He wouldn't discuss his crimes, his family, or anything else. One psychologist wrote in a report, "Subject displays a complete absence of emotional expression and appears uninterested in any aspect of his own past or future. The lack of empathy is extreme. Further observation is recommended, though the prognosis is unfavorable." Unfavorable. That's a clinical way of saying what everyone already understood, that Amarjeet Sada was almost certainly beyond the reach of anything the Indian juvenile justice system could offer. In 2016, Amarjeet Sada turned 18. Under the law, he could no longer be held in a juvenile facility. The system had to make a decision: transfer him to an adult prison, place him in a psychiatric institution, or, if he was somehow deemed rehabilitated, release him. What actually happened is unclear. The information is contradictory and incomplete, shrouded by the same laws that protect the identities of juvenile offenders, laws that, once they age out of the juvenile system, don't automatically disappear. Some sources say he was transferred to a high-security psychiatric facility. Others say he was moved to an adult prison. A few suggest, though this seems unlikely, that he was released under supervision. In 2019, an investigative journalist claimed to have reached the facility where Amarjeet had been held as a boy. He spoke to guards who remembered him. They described him as strange, quiet, inhuman. One said, "I never saw him smile. I never saw him cry. He was like a machine." Another added, "When he turned 18, people came in civilian clothes, put him in a car, and drove away. Nobody told us where. I never heard his name again." That absence of information breeds speculation. Online theories claim he was secretly placed in a research program. Others say the state quietly disposed of him. Some insist he escaped and now lives under a false identity somewhere in India. The most likely truth is less dramatic, but no less troubling. That Amarjeet Sada is somewhere in India's prison or psychiatric system, forgotten by everyone except a handful of bureaucrats managing his file. That he spends his days in a cell, perhaps medicated, perhaps not, perhaps as devoid of empathy as he was at 8 years old. Or, and this is the thought that's hardest to sit with, he was released. Maybe he lives now under a different name, in a different place. Maybe he works. Maybe he functions in society. Maybe he's learned to mask his lack of empathy, to simulate the emotions that other people feel naturally, to pass as ordinary. Psychopathy doesn't disappear. It can't be cured. It can only be managed. And some people with the condition do learn to mimic appropriate social behavior. Some psychopaths lead apparently normal lives, jobs, relationships, no criminal record. Others don't. Which category Amarjeet Sada belongs to, nobody knows. Back in the village of Mushahar, life goes on the way it always has. Children are born and die. The rice grows and is harvested. The monsoon comes and goes. The poverty remains, constant, unchanged, eternal. But something has shifted. Mothers hold their children closer. They don't leave them unattended the way they once did. When children play in the shade of the trees, someone is always watching. The memory of what happened has been woven into the fabric of the community. The hut where Amarjeet's family lived still stands. Or its ruins do. Nobody lives there. In a village where every inch of ground is precious, where families are packed into impossibly small spaces, this hut sits empty. People say it's cursed. Children don't go near it. The bamboo grove where Khushbu's body was found has its own place in the village's collective memory. Some say they hear crying there at night. Others say they've seen small figures moving between the stems. Superstition, of course. The product of trauma and fear. But in a place where the spirit world is as real as the physical one, these stories carry weight. Chanchan Devi, who lost her daughter Khushbu, never fully recovered. Neighbors say she fell into a deep depression, stopped caring for her home, stopped caring for herself. The village had no means to help her psychologically. No therapists, no antidepressants, nothing. Only the silence of other women who carried their own unbearable losses. For the wider world, Amarjeet Sada became a symbol of different things depending on who was looking. For some, he was proof of systemic failure. A child failed at every possible stage, from the absence of prenatal care to the lack of any response after the first warning signs. A child who might have had a different outcome if he had been born somewhere else, into a different family, with access to the medical and psychological support that could have identified what was happening inside his developing brain. For others, he was evidence of something that no amount of social intervention could explain or address, that some evil is not produced by circumstance, that it arrives wired into a person from the beginning, that some children are simply born without the capacity for empathy, and no amount of therapy or poverty reduction would have changed what he became. The debate mirrors one of the oldest questions in criminology and philosophy: nature or nurture? In Amarjeet's case, where does the impact of extreme poverty, violence, and neglect end? And where does something neurological, something inborn, something fundamentally different about the structure of his brain begin? The research on identical twins raised apart shows that certain personality traits, including aggression and antisocial behavior, have a genetic component. But research on children raised in severely traumatizing environments shows that those environments can literally alter brain structure, switching off genes associated with empathy and switching on those associated with threat response. Amarjeet was the product of one of the most extreme environments imaginable. Whether he would have developed differently, given different circumstances, is something we will never know. And that's the thing about this case that I keep coming back to. Not the horror of what he did, though it is horrifying. Not the question of what happened to him after he turned 18, though that question sits uncomfortably. It's this. In Bihar, in the forgotten villages of Mushahar, children are still being born into exactly the same conditions. Still playing barefoot on baked earth, still dying young and without care. And somewhere among them, maybe, there is another child whose brain is developing differently, whose empathy isn't waking up the way it should, who watches the world with eyes that don't show the ordinary human light. A child that nobody will notice until it is too late. Because that's the real horror of this story. Not what already happened, though it was terrible. But that it can happen again. That it probably will. Because the poverty still exists. Because the violence still exists. Because the absence of care still exists. And somewhere in the dark of forgotten villages, another generation of children is growing up unseen, unhelped, unheard, until it's too late. Amarjeet Sada, wherever he is now, remains an unanswered question. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know if he's alive. We don't know whether he ever came to understand the weight of what he did, or whether he is still the same boy with the empty eyes, for whom death was as unremarkable as a stone dropped into water. In the silence surrounding his case, the silence enforced by law, by bureaucracy, by the discomfort of a society that doesn't know how to hold what he represents, there is only an echo of the question that everyone asks, though few want to hear the answer. Could he have been helped? If he had been born somewhere else, a different family, a different time, a different country, would he have become someone different? Were his crimes inevitable from the moment of his birth, written into his genes and the architecture of his brain? Or were they the product of an environment so brutal that it crossed the threshold of what a human being can endure while still remaining fully human? We don't know. We will never know. And maybe that, the not knowing, is the hardest part of all. That's all for tonight. But before you leave this darkness, take a moment. Every story you heard here really happened. Somewhere there are people who remember, who still can't sleep at night, who are still searching for answers. Crime is never just a story. It's someone's life that went terribly wrong, or was taken by someone who thought they would get away with it. And sometimes they do. But silence has a way of speaking. Eventually. If this story made you feel something, leave a comment. Just one word. One sign that you were here, that you listened, that you remember. Because that's what Silent Crime Stories is all about.